Now, resolve. The USFG should require that all K through 12 students attend public schools. Now, all of the definitions in this case are contextual. We have, since the word should indicates a policy round, so we're going to be having the weighing mechanism of net benefits, the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. And our plan is simply that the USFG will require all K through 12 students to attend public schools. The agent enforcer is the USFG. And with that, I'd go into my first contention, which is that of the leading for change. So right now, the problem is that private schools allow the rich parents and those who are in the upper class a way to escape what the public school systems lack around their neighborhood. So we see that they have the ability to simply avoid the problems like in their hometown that are happening by sending their children to private schools by paying tens of thousands of dollars each year. However, what we see is this is actually detrimental to all of the people who don't have the opportunity to pay for a private school. Now what's going to happen? Once the plan passes, we see that all of these parents who will before send their kids to private schools will now have to send their kids to public schools. Now a few things will happen. The first thing that will happen is first we'll see that if the rich people decide to send their children to the public school and we see that there's things that are not as good in the public school, we see that more change will happen because these parents who have more money have more resources, and they're the ones who are able to actually make the changes in the school that for instance parents who don't have a lot of money to get involved in their in their child's life, such as petitioning to the school board about hiring better teachers or making sure that there's better drinking fountains or all of that. Now those parents who have more money can either pay money for the school to either give donations or to actually make changes by going to the board, because we see that those people have more money to have more opportunities. So what we see is this is going to lead to better facilities in the actual schools, not only because of the donations that the parents who are richer will be able to give, but it's also going to lead to better changes in terms of teachers and classroom sizes and supplies that will be provided, because again, the whole point is that the rich parents who are able to send their kids to private schools, once they send these kids to public schools, they're the ones who have the money to make the changes happen. Another thing that's going to happen is we actually see that the government is going to spend more money on education, because right now a lot of the states, they have, even if they have a high rate of their students going to colleges, or even if their students are getting high ACT scores or high testing scores, we see that all those scores are centered around the private school area. So even though the house may have a really good private school next to it, the public school may not be as good. So we see that once all of these people have to go to public schools, which is about 10 million of the high school from K through 12 students will be attending public schools, we see that the government will spend more money on education for a few reasons. The first reason is obviously the more people who go to public schools, now you need more resources. But again, it's the second thing, and it's very sad to say, but in our society, the people who make changes are ones who have the power and in position to make the changes are. For instance, all of the politicians, right? They have the money and the opportunities to send their children to very nice private schools, right? Now, if their children now have to be sent to public schools, they're the ones who can easily make the changes of, okay, maybe I should give more money towards education. It's very simple things like this. Again, you don't have to be a politician to make a change in society. Yes?
So just to be clear, though, your plan does not designate more funding for public schooling, right?
No. Our plan, it's not in our plan. Our plan is simply just to require that all K through 12 students attend public schools, but this is something that's very obviously going to happen if you give these rich families who are used to luxury and good education and a very small teacher to student ratio, and you throw them into a class with 50 kids to one teacher, they will not be happy, and they're the ones with the money to make the changes for that to happen. So we see that it's a direct link that's going to happen. Yes.
So how long would it take for these parents to get all this stuff done and make it all better?
Well, we don't know how long it's going to take. I guess it depends on the area, but the thing is, you're not looking at a 1 second change. Maybe it won't happen in a month, right? But education is forever, right? It's these education systems that are teaching students, and they're lasting decades, right? You get taught in high school for 4 years, but then that education determines what college you go to, and then that college determines what job you're able to get. So it doesn't matter like if the change doesn't happen in like a month. It matters that like once these changes happen, they'll change for a very long time. And again, we see the impact is that the education will increase in funding by the government, or simply just parents will donate to schools, and that actually has no time frame. That like happens like right away. Most parents donate to the school, like in terms of like small amount of money for a sport you're on, or a club that you're on, or like the debate team, right? But again, if these parents with more money then send these kids to public schools, donations will get bigger, and that will actually happen right away, to answer your question. Going into the second contention of this will decrease the socioeconomic divide, because right now there's a huge problem in like the stigma of private schools is the fact that the only people that have access to actually send their kids to private schools are the very, very wealthy. Even the middle class has trouble sending their kids to middle school, like private middle and high schools, because we see right now, especially in the United States, the cost of education is a little ridiculous. So even people in the middle class who are trying to save up to pay for their sons or daughters' college education won't have the money to send them to a private school. So we see that it's only the very best of the people who are able to go to these private schools. We see that they have they have a smaller student to teacher ratio, they have higher points on standardized tests, and this only continues the system of like oppression, because we see that it's that the 43% of people who attend private schools are actually white, compared to 27% of public schools. 43% of the private schools are virtually all white, compared to only 20% of the public schools that are all white. So again, we see that by passing the plan, we will stop this socioeconomic divide by having a very inclusive type of school system. And for those reasons, please vote aye.
Okay. Is everyone ready? Okay, so start time now. I will be negating today's resolution. Our main points are that you make the public school system worse when you do this harsh of an integration. So the first disadvantage is about funding. Our first uniqueness point or background point about what is going on in the status quo is that 10% of all students in the U.S. attend private K through 12 schools. This is according to the RAPE, what?
The American Federation of Teachers.
The American Federation of Teachers. The second uniqueness point is that public schools are currently critically underfunded by $19 billion. So adding another 6 million kids, which is the 10% number, will make this system much worse. Now, let's get to this where they say that they're going to allocate more money. Their plan does not do that, and we can't just assume that the government will give them more money. The government is already underfunding public schools. That's not enough work for that. Second of all, let's be nice and assume that the funding that goes to private schools from the government will now go to public schools. If you do the division out, the money gained is about $9 billion, but divided by students, it goes from $1,170 per student to $1,130 per student. In other words, this is a net loss of funding no matter what the scenario is. The third uniqueness point is that adding 10% of students into the public school system will cause a lot of havoc in the whole entire system. They kind of play this off and say it'll be a month or two, but this is a much bigger problem. Schools couldn't handle capacity initially. Student to teacher ratios would be ridiculous initially. In poor areas, education would actively get worse, yeah?
You do understand that it's not like all this 10% all going in one school. It's distributed around like the 20,000 schools in the United States.
Okay, I know.
These people are being.
Yeah, thank you. I know that adding 10% of students to every single school in the United States would make it worse. I know that's a fact. So the fourth uniqueness point is that the private youth school industry currently would collapse. Private school industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So basically, on the links or what their plan does, that is bad. First of all, public schools would have to accept 10% more students. The second link is that public schools would be even more drastically underfunded with the switch. The third link is that this leads to worse education for everyone in the public school system, and it means that people don't have the option of the private school system. In other words, a flat-out decrease in education. So the impacts of this are the loss of education. Again, you lose it in the private schools, you lose it in the public schools, and you lose it in the havoc that happens when you do this. This makes cyclical poverty worse because when public school systems can't function, it means that people can't lift themselves out of poverty. And this is, again, a loss of jobs. It's the most probable impact in today's debate, which is why it's the most important. The second disad is that of religious backlash. So on the uniqueness or the background points. The first background point is, according to Gallup, 37% of Americans are highly religious. The second background point is that religious people in the U.S. tend to prefer right-wing nationalistic politics. According to the New York Times, white evangelical support for Trump was 80%, which was much higher than any other demographic. So, because, again, the support was because of the perceived threat from Muslims and Mexicans on, like, the American ideal of Christianity. The third uniqueness point is that private religious schools are key to the freedom of religion. The First Amendment says that the government cannot actively encourage or discourage religion. Stopping private schools, which many of which are religious, effectively discourages religion and will be seen as an existential threat. So the fourth uniqueness point is that marginalized groups are currently at risk. Look to the travel ban, look to the fact that Trump wants to repeal Roe v. Wade, look to all of these things that are happening. So the links are what happens when, I have a lot to get through, I'll get to it later. The links are what happens. Forcing public schools onto the religious population, again, 37%, will be seen as an existential threat. It challenges the First Amendment. Again, according to Anthony Scalia, who is a member of the Supreme Court, strict constitutionalism often gets blended with conservatism. In other words, conservatives tend to believe that the Constitution ought to be sacred, so violating it will very much anger them. The second link is that this leads to a conservative backlash. According to the CNN, a growing number of fundamentalist Christians believe that the government is singling them out for persecution. The third link is that this leads to worse policies for minorities and marginalized groups. Authoritarians win elections by blaming issues on other groups. So the impacts of this contention is that we have a less safe environment in the country for marginalized groups. It makes their literal lives less safe. Yeah.
Well, the marginalized groups that you're talking about are going to be harmed how if then you say that, like, the people who are the ones who are discriminating, like, against them are the ones who are going to be, like, suffering.
The ones who are suffering will then vote in extremist politics that will, like, hurt them. They did that last time with Trump. That's what happened. So, on to the affirmative case. So basically, the story of the affirmative case is that inequality is not an impact in itself. Inequality is bad, but having a system where every single person is worse off is much worse. Okay, so basically, when they talk about how parents will be forced to send their kids to public schools and then they will donate more, they don't give any numbers for how relevant donations are to school funding. We give you actual numbers and analysis that shows that the average funding would drop. Again, they say better facilities from donating. This would take months, if not years. This disrupts a whole entire generation of kids in the school districts, public and private. When they talk about how the government will spend more money on education, for two reasons. First of all, they will need more resources. This is not an argument. This is saying the government will do it because that's the right thing. The government is already underfunding school districts. You just make it worse by flooding the school districts without allocating more funds explicitly. The second point is that people who are rich will start to influence politics in order to get more money into the public school districts. Again, this is an entirely long shot. If I believe that the rich in this country have that much influence, I would honestly believe that they would lobby against the law quicker than that. This is not what will happen. So, the impacts of a better school district do not happen because you lower the average funding for public school districts. You cause havoc as you do this large change, which they said could be a couple months. That's a part of a year. And you hurt the private school industry, where people cannot opt into private schools when public schools are not good. On the second advantage, which is about decreased socioeconomic divide. So they basically say only people who have access are very healthy. Yes, but also people use private schools when the public schools are failing them. When you take away these private schools, you do actively take away education from some people. Maybe you make it more equal by dragging everyone down, but that is not net benefits. We're not talking about equality, we're talking about net benefits. So when we see that they drop funding overall for school districts, it means that they lose. So basically, they talked about the continuing system of oppression and about white versus minority divide. Oh yeah, by the way, this goes on the first advantage too. When they talk about how rich people will then go into poor school districts, rich people and poor people are very divided in where they live. They would attend different schools, which means that defensively, their advantage has no actual risk of solvency, because they would just get public schools that are like private schools, but more inconvenient and an average drop in funding. So, where does this debate land today? The negation is going to come up and try to talk about equality and how bad the system is. But you have to remember, when they don't allocate funding and they just say donations will fix it, even though rich people live far away from poor people in the status quo, all they are doing is lowering the average amount of funding, cutting out private school for those who can afford it, and doing all these things that might make the world more equal, but it does not make it a better place. So for the reason that, first of all, they lower funding, and they cause a religious backlash, as we have already seen under Trump, that will hurt minorities in the long term, I urge a strong negation vote.
Okay, so I'm gonna go neg case then app case. Okay, so I will start my time now. Okay, so going straight into this. So their first contention was bad about funding. So they basically say that status quo, so we're going to have 10% of all US students are going to basically be added into public schools, and they say that our plan doesn't actually have money. However, we see that public schools actually get money per student. So every public, like when I attend school, every day that I attend school, the public school, my school gets money for me being there that day. So we see with the increase in students in these schools, these public schools are actually going to be getting more money, and this money is going to be going to supporting these new students, but as well as increasing facilities and basically making these schools better. So yes.
Yeah, so why didn't you specify in your plan text that there would be an increase in funding?
So this isn't actually a direct like part of the plan. This is going to be like a direct link as a result of the plan. That these public schools are going to get more money per student, and we see that even though that the public schools aren't necessarily getting enough money right now, this is a set amount of money per student per day, which the government is required to give to these public schools. So this money is going to be guaranteed to be given to these public schools. So this idea about funding, the funding is actually, we are going to be solving for funding, and in fact, we see that private schools, these parents of private school children, they pay these $20,000 or like the really expensive tuition fees, but they also are donating like hundreds of thousands, if not like millions of dollars to these private schools every year. And this money, yes.
Why would they donate it to public schools?
Okay, so these parents are right now in status quo. They're donating to private schools, right? This is essentially in order to make, in order to have a better education for their children. So we see that this money, this money is actually whether or not it be like all of these millions of dollars, which is going, we're going to see a large portion of this money actually be going to these public schools in order, because these parents, and again, as my partner brought up, these politicians like Betsy DeVos, who's in charge of funding for, or in charge of a lot of like public schools and charter schools, like I think she's like on the board of education. She her children actually attend like very expensive private schools. So we see that these rich politicians who are actually going to be in charge of making these laws don't necessarily see the struggles and the lackings of public schools. So this is going to be really important, because we can see that it's like inherently, statistically we can see that these richer parents want success for their kids and will go to lengths to use money in order to get this, as like they're sending their kids to private schools. So if they see that public school education isn't working or isn't helpful enough, they will be spending more money into these public schools and investing more money into this. So their first contention about funding, they talk about like having a worse education because they're going to be underfunded. However, in this money like analysis that they bring up, they're not actually accounting for donations of these parents, and these donations are going to be a large part of what's going to be increasing funding for schools. And they also aren't considering the money that the extra money that the government is going to be getting. So again, these numbers that they brought up aren't actually going to be valid. Next, and they talk about like it makes cyclical poverty worse because of education. But again, cyclical poverty is when people who are impoverished are going to remain being impoverished, and this is actually going to be continuing on in status quo. And I'll go back and explain that more in the affirmations case. So the first contention about funding, you can turn that and basically turn that onto the affirmation and see how we're actually going to be increasing funding for public schools. Next, the contention about religious backlash. They talk about how basically stopping private schools is going to decrease religious freedom. Okay, I have a couple of responses to that. First of all, we see that charter schools are actually present in the United States. Charter schools, which are again a form of public schools, are allow for religion to be taught in schools, but through a secular perspective, so that it's not actually violating the First Amendment, but we see that religion can still be taught in school. So again, this whole idea of backlash is going to be decreased. But again, these people who are sending their kids to private schools, they go to church on the weekends, and they have many methods in which they can educate their children about religion and So this whole idea that there's this one major link that they take from these highly religious Americans to being like really angry about this isn't actually going to stand, and then they take that further and link it to like more extremist policies, and we see that this isn't actually going to be true. First of all, because of the presence of charter schools all around the country, all around the country, and then they also talk about this idea about a less like safe environment and like how people will vote like extremists. But first of all, like the whole like travel ban and stuff, we see that there is a Supreme Court for that. So there's like these things can be ruled unconstitutional. So nothing really unconstitutional is can stay for a long time. So this whole idea about religious backlash, it's like a really slippery slope on how they're trying to get to basically less safe environment for marginalized groups, and then there's also charter schools present. So going on into the affirmations case. So they started this off by saying that inequality is not an impact. However, when we're looking at net benefits, we need to be looking through the lens of the poor. We see that the rich are going to be getting good education because parents of richer students are known to be more focused, more involved in schoolwork, and basically encourage their children to go to college. And no matter if they go to a public school or a private school, they're going to get a decent education and basically go to college. But it's these lower class students that we are going to be seeing the net benefits for in the affirmations world by increasing equality, by providing everyone with the same same education. So they talk about like no numbers about donations and stuff like that, but we see that this is a logical transition that the affirmation can make, that because these rich parents are going to be upset at the poor schooling and poor schooling in public schools, they're going to donate money. And next, we see that they say it'll take months or years for better facilities, but again, they're admitting that there are going to be better facilities, better teachers, decrease in the teacher to student ratio, which is all going to be beneficial for education as a whole, and they actually are conceding this. And even if it takes months or even like 2 to 3 years, this is going to be actually net beneficial for the impoverished people who right now are suffering in poor public school facilities. Okay, next, in our second contention, we talked about decreasing like the socioeconomic divide, and they talk about how basically we're taking away, in the affirmations plan, we're taking away the idea of like people using private schools for education. However, this isn't actually going to be, or just because we're taking away these private schools, we see that these impacts that we're going to be the impacts that you're going to be weighing this debate on are going to be the impoverished students. Whoever is going to be solving for the impoverished students better, because we see that these students of richer families have historically been more successful, whether it be in public schools or private schools. So if we're able to make private schools better, we're going to be solving better. And they also talk about how rich people don't live near the poor. But we see that if you look to metropolitan cities, these are areas where the rich and poor live side by side. Like even in Santa Monica, you can see that, and yeah, you see that. So, but it's just the difference is that the rich people and historically white people are going to be sending their children to these private schools, which again we're solving in our plan. Yeah. Also, in the South, there aren't that many schools, so whether you're rich or poor, you're still going to be going to the same school. So these people are still actually living in relatively close areas. So that are just talking about for the affirmation.
So it'll be disads and then application order. Okay, everyone ready? Starting time now. The point where my opponents lose this debate is the point where they don't understand the logistics of the entire situation and where their links are extremely improbable. So So let's go over why this is the case. So first, on our second uniqueness point, they say that like public schools are going to get more money per student, and it's still going to be it's going to be better because of that. First, they don't tell you if this overcomes our net decrease in funding because of how underfunded private schools are, and they don't tell you if this is actually going to make education outcomes better for these private school students, or if it's going to make it better overall. They don't tell you if this provides a net benefit. They just say it's going to increase funding. That's not enough. They have to tell you more. Additionally, when they try to say that like donations will solve, okay, like donations are not going. First, they're not going to be fast enough to overcome anything. Like when you donate money, like you have to be invested into the school. It's going to take a long time for people to donate money. And additionally, like they don't give you numbers for how much of the school budgets depend on donations. That's extremely important. That's something that they cold concede out of their speeches. This is extremely important. They don't tell you why, like, if donations are a significant amount and would actually be able to solve for the harms that we set out. And so that's another reason to drop them. Additionally, segregation is extremely important. They say that rich and poor people live side by side in metropolitan areas, but like there's also a lot of places where there's rich suburbs and poor suburbs, and the rich and poor in cities are also segregated. They're segregated by neighborhoods, ghettos, all that stuff. All of this stuff this plan actively makes it worse. All of this stuff actively makes it worse. And they say like which politicians and so on would like solve for this or something. Yeah, which politicians would solve for this. But like, look to the fact that my partner said that the link that rich people would just advocate against the law and lobby against the law is a much more probable link. So yes, fiat allows for you to faithfully implement the plan, but at the point where their link is after fiat and our link is also after fiat, you should prefer our link because rich people are going to be more likely to just advocate against the law than to donate money to public schools. I think that makes more sense. So basically, this funding decide just flows through because at the point, and additionally, like the logistics of this. So on our third uniqueness point, the logistics of this are exactly what win us this dissat. The most important thing here is that schools would literally just not have the capacity to do this. Like imagine 10% more students go into your public schools. Are they going to have enough classrooms? Are they going to have enough teachers? Are they going to have enough lunch? Are they going to have enough parking spaces? This is not a logistically possible thing to do, and would actively make education worse for everyone. Because student-teacher ratios would be way off, student-teacher pay would be off because they'd have to hire more teachers to administer more students. All of this stuff means that this is logistically impossible and will actively harm the education of everyone. Okay, on the second dissat. So, the religious backlash. So, they say that their main refutation in this is that charter schools are public schools and that allows them to teach. Two responses to this. One, public schools and charter schools are two different categories. Charter schools are not a type of public school. It's public schools, charter schools, and private schools. There's a reason why they're separated. The resolution says public schools, not charter schools. So to say that, I don't think works. Like these are separate categories. Additionally, it doesn't matter if you have charter schools. When you actively ban private schools, religious people are going to see that as an attack. It does not matter whether or not they can go to charter schools or not. It matters that the religious people see that the government is actively trying to take away their ability to teach their children religion. I'll get to it at the end if I have time, sorry. So basically, the perception of this matters more than anything else. And so all of our impacts flow through about how this is going to radicalize the religious right and make it worse for minorities to live in this country, and more nationalist policies will get implemented because people like Trump will continue to get elected instead of just fading out like nationalist sentiment is now. Additionally, they had another response where they said like the Supreme Court checks back on constitutional stuff. However, the Supreme Court in the status quo is extremely conservative and just voted a 5-4 decision to make a man go through a very painful execution because the Constitution only bans more painful execution methods. This Supreme Court is not the one that you want checking back on this policy. So basically, all of our impacts flow through on this dissat as well. The nationalism will increase, nationalist policies will increase, and it will actively make it harder to live in this country as a minority. Okay, on the advantage. So they respond to our response about how they don't give numbers by saying that's a logical transition and that it's going to take more money away and so on. However, this is about the numbers that they need to give are the percentage of the budget that is done by donations. They need to give a number on how many people would donate and so on. They need to give you numbers instead of just saying, oh, rich people would donate. That's not good enough. They have to give you more. Yeah, like this would actively drop funding from $1,170 per student to $1,140 per student. This is existentially bad. And then also they cold concede the fact that this will disrupt an entire generation's education. This is what I talked about earlier. The logistics are impossible. When you are put into a 50-person class, as they said, it's going to actively make it harder to go to college. It's going to actively trap you in poverty. All of these impacts are outweigh any impacts that they have. And then they say, in response to our rich would lobby against the law, yeah, so I already responded to that. Cross-apply my response from earlier. Okay, so on the second advantage. So they say that, they just say that like rich and poor people live next to each other in metropolitan areas. I already responded to that. And so basically, like, what they basically drop here is that in poor areas, people use private schools to actively get better education. So at the very least, you're going to be taking away a good education from those that want it. And so, and it's not going to make education any better for those poor people in that area because you're increasing the student capacity by 10% and ruining the school's ability to actively administer a good education. So all of these things still flow through. We are winning on every single point. So the story of the round essentially is that if you increase the amount of students in any public schools by 10%, and then you don't allocate more funding, and you admit and you concede the fact that public schools are underfunded by $19 billion, you do two things. One, you admit that this is logistically impossible, and you admit that this would actively make education worse for those who are switching from private schools to public schools. And at the point where net benefits is the most important thing and not inequality, you should be voting on the fact that this plan actively makes education worse for literally everyone in America by increasing the capacity that public schools have to take and by actively making private education worse in poor areas. So you're going to be voting neg because this is way too expensive and would actively make public schools worse. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be doing 3 voters and then 2 impact arguments that you can flow on like a news sheet or something. Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, so starting time now. The first voter is funding. We read you evidence that even if all private school funds from the federal government get allocated to public schools, there will be less. It's $1,170 versus $1,140. This is the only number that's thrown out in today's debate, and it basically means that funding decreases. Now, all they say is that the government will do it because they have to fund school districts, but they're clearly not acting responsibly. Look to the $19 billion underfunded. They cannot just say that they'll do it because they have to. That is not enough of an argument for them to be winning this point. Now, donations. They do not read any evidence about how much donations affect. Like, they don't give any evidence for this. So we can't really interact with it at all, and it should not even really count as an argument because there's no numbers. You should prefer actual numbers in this debate. Also, it does not respond to the segregation point. When wealthy people live apart from poor people, it means that they will go to a different public school and donate more to that public school. In the best case, you've created a new private school system. That's what we said, and they basically said, oh, poor people and rich people live side by side. No, they do not. Segregation is deeply ingrained in America. That's how property values work. So, and also, you just take away private education from people. I'll get to this on the impact level, but that's basically the main conceded impact. The second voter is logistical difficulty. We tell you how difficult it would be to integrate an extra 10% students into public school districts. They just said it would work, even if it takes 3 years. They said 3 years in their last speech. 3 years, or even a few months, is critically disrupting the education system. This links into systematic poverty because you ruin the public school district. Again, they can't just say it would work because it's the government. It's your job as the government team to provide the plan and explain why it would work. So this would disrupt the system completely. If you want to ignore the funding question, you can just vote on that because it's an illogical plan. Again, we're saying to do nothing. You should not do something if the plan threatens to be a logistical confusing mess. The third voting issue is religious backlash. the perceptual link still holds. We tell you that conservative-leaning people are religious and they see any attack on their religion as an attack on them. We also tell you that they vote in policy that hurts marginalized groups more. This gets conceded. The only response is that charter schools are also religious, so they won't backlash. This is not true. They'll still backlash from the perception. Also, charter schools are not public schools. There's public schools, private schools, and charter schools. You make everyone go to public schools. They should not be able to make that argument. So basically, you can vote on that argument because it's conceded out of the gate. The perceptual link still holds. So, on the impacts. This is net benefits. It's about every person, not just inequality. So the first argument is about probability. You should prefer probability because honestly there's too much muddy water to determine whether this will actually improve school districts for the poor. What we do know is that it would be a nightmare when you implement it. It would cause lots of issues in the short term, which does matter. It disrupts the educational cycle for public schools. So the second impact argument is do not let them come up and say that they decrease inequality or help the poor. We are winning on the poor people of America and the rich people. Here's why. So on the poor level, they make a mess of the public school system. They have probably lower funding. The only numbers indicate that they do have lower funding, unless you believe the donation link. And again, that doesn't hold with the segregation. And they lead to worse policy for marginalized groups, which are disproportionately poor. So on the inequality argument even, we win. And moreover, it gets conceded that they take away private education from people who can afford it. This is an impact. Equality is not an impact when you just make everyone's education worse. So for the reason that the plan does not really make sense and it could cause a big mess, the only numbers indicate a drop in funding for school districts, and the religious backlash gets conceded, I urge a strong negation ballot.
Okay, I'll start my time now. So at the end of the day, you're voting AF because of the following few reasons. The first reason I want to talk about is like their voter issue of funding. There's some things that I want to cover. The first issue is the fact that they say that we have a lack of funding that's going to wreak havoc everywhere. Okay, and they say that since we don't give money on how much schools depend on donations, that we can't make any arguments. I want to clarify a few things that we both have made clear. The first thing is the fact that no school will wreak havoc from this 10% because the government is required to give schools money based on the amount of people that attend. So the whole 10% is covered by the government. What we're talking about donations is additional money that would not be in the negations plan, that would only be found in the affirmation, because people who would, instead of sending their kids to private schools, would now send them to public schools. They said that we don't have fiat or we don't talk about it in their plan. The resolution is that the USFG should require that all K through 12 students attend public schools. You can infer that private schools will no longer be a thing, but we didn't write it in our plan text. That doesn't mean that it's not going to happen because we didn't involve it in our plan text. The way the government works is it provides education and money to public schools based on the amount of people that enroll. So with more people to enroll, that more money will be covered. Then they talk about this $19 billion. Number one, they're not solving for the $19 billion. That's status quo. They're still talking about that. Number two, we are the only side that has a small, even if there's a small, there's still a chance of actually solving this $19 billion, because who is in charge of the $19 billion deficit? Politicians. Politicians are the ones with money and power, and if their kids are all of a sudden going to bad schools, they're the ones who have the power to make the decisions, so they're the only ones who can actually solve for the $19 billion deficit. Then, their basically only refutation to our plan is the fact that segregation exists in the United States. While maybe in parts of California there's these suburbs where really rich people live, right? We're talking about net benefits, so we want to talk about the whole United States. Number one, in all of the cities in the United States where there's a really large amount, the population is the biggest in these cities, that's where people of all different incomes live right next to each other. So that's when those donations and funding would really come in hand. And number two, in the South, where it's a lot less densely populated, we see that someone could live far away from each other and maybe in a nicer house, so but they'd still belong to the same school district, because there's not as many schools in the South that there are here, where it's if you live in this 5-mile radius, you go to this school, and you live in another 5-mile radius, this school. So again, we're talking about all of the United States. The negation is only thinking of the part of the United States that they know, where there's schools everywhere, right? So it's totally about if you live in a nice house, you go to a nice public school. We're talking about everywhere in the United States where people don't have options like that. So if you have money, you send your kid to a private school, and if you don't have money, your kid is stuck in a bad system. Then going into the point of like leading for change, they didn't really talk about the issue where it's like if every single person goes like our like huge like voting issue that like they kind of like ignore is the part that if you vote for the affirmation, you're basically trying to increase the you're trying to decrease the socioeconomic divide and the prevalent racism found in society. All they say is we solve for minorities because we're gonna stop radical people from voting against them. Number one, like they don't actually solve for that because one, like even though like okay, charter schools are public schools just because like they don't know, like I don't know how to argue against that. It's just like a fact. They receive funding from the government. They're public schools. Number two,
Okay, wait,
the
point of
government.
order, stop
Okay.
time. The specific argument that they're public schools because they receive government funding is new, and like we argued already about how private schools also receive government funding, and we won't have time to respond to it. So I don't think it should be like taken as a new argument.
Okay, I'll keep going. Okay. Number two, these white like evangelical. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. They who are actually, I want to point out, the ones who are restricting minorities of their rights are not going to be like hurt about their First Amendment rights because we're banning all private schools, not just religious ones. And even though some of them might be religious,
Yeah, well,
they're okay.
the argument that you're banning all private schools, so it's not a big deal, is new.
Well, that's our plan text.
Okay, under your judge's discretion.
Okay. Okay. And then so I'd like to and I'll continue my time. Now, so anyway, they don't actually solve for any of the problems like of the poor, and the whole part that like they point out is like we're basically like if you vote like neg, you're gonna take away a good education from someone who wants it. That's not true. Like basically like we're just trying to even out the playing field because a lot of people who want to succeed simply don't have the opportunities. And I just want to go over like if you think about it, right, if all of these really rich people like have to send their kids to public schools, right, number one, the people who like succeed will like we're not actually taking away anything from them because rich people can like buy like things for their children to succeed and all of that. So like if you look down to like the net benefits of it, the negation doesn't have any actual benefits because the funding isn't like was canceled out, and the religious backslash I've already proved like doesn't make sense, and people who vote for Trump will vote for him if he does whatever like he wants to do. And then in the affirmation you're actually helping the people, and you're like helping the socioeconomic divide, and you're creating change. So for all those reasons, please vote AF.
Great round, guys.
Yeah, thank you.